this is just the beginning.
Welcome to an Axios virtual event, One Big Thing, the Path Toward Infrastructure. I'm Mike Allen, a co-founder of Axios, coming to you from Axios HQ in Arlington, Virginia. Thank you to United Airlines for making these conversations possible. And thank you for joining us on Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, LinkedIn, and on Axios.com. We'd love for you to join the conversation going on Twitter at Axios, #Axios Events. I'll be joined by my colleague Hans Nichols, who's been covering these infrastructure negotiations. Our first guest is Brian Deese from the White House, where he's director of the National Economic Council. This is round two for Brian. He was a senior advisor to President Obama. He's a Yale lawyer, a Boston guy. Brian Deese, welcome to Axios.
Oh, I'm happy to be here. Thanks, Mike.
Brian, President Biden's infrastructure plan would rewire a big part of the economy. It's not just broadband, roads, bridges, it's short-term jobs, it's long-term jobs. The administration sees it as a bridge from crisis to stability.
Absolutely right. This is about investing in our country in a way that we haven't done in decades, but we know works. We've seen our public investment in research and R&D and our infrastructure fall by about 40% over the last 40 years. This is a plan to remedy that over the next 8 years, investing in our transportation infrastructure, our power infrastructure, and the digital infrastructure of the future, as well as in our workers to make sure that those who need to get to work can get to work. This is a plan that would increase the productive capacity of our economy. It would bring more workers into the workforce, and it would position us to actually compete and win in this 21st century economy.
But Brian, first you have to pass it. So you've been spending so much time on the Hill that people say that you should have an office up there. Take us inside those meetings. What's it like? How tense is it?
Well, one of the realities of the current situation we find ourselves in is a lot of the meetings are like this one over Zoom, but up on in person as well. The meetings have been highly substantive and serious. I would say not tense, but focused on the substance. And we've made a lot of progress in identifying some areas where there's common ground. There's a lot of understanding that we need to, for example, invest in our supply chains and build our domestic manufacturing base in areas like semiconductors, investing in R&D. Areas like broadband, there's a broad agreement we need to invest in affordable high-speed internet all across the country. We've identified some areas of disagreement as well. That's to be expected. But overall, these conversations have progressed. They continue to progress. And we're making progress. It's not always pretty, but that's the legislative process, and we are making progress.
So you've put a lot of effort into getting Republicans on board. President Biden has spent a lot of time with Republicans, but it sounds like that ship has sailed. Our conversations with Republicans on the Hill, they sound pretty deflated. Is it just about time to go it alone, pass this just with Democrats?
President Biden has been consistent that his view is that the ideas in the American Jobs Plan are not Democratic ideas or Republican ideas. And the best way forward is to operate in a bipartisan manner wherever we can.
But you've tried it, and Brian, you've tried it, it's not working.
Well, I think that's not how we see things. We're having conversations that continue. We've had constructive conversations with Senator Capito and a group of Republicans. We are engaged with a bipartisan group that we anticipate is going to be bringing forward some ideas this week. Those are conversations that are going to continue. I think one thing you can expect from President Biden is that he is not going to stop reaching out. He's not going to stop looking for areas to find common ground. And at the same time, what you've heard from him is that his only red line is inaction. And so we're moving on multiple fronts, as is expected from the legislative process, so that we can advance key elements of his plan this summer.
But if you had to, in the end, you're prepared to do it with Democrats as you have in the past.
Look, I think that what you're seeing is a process that is unfolding. This is it's been a while, so we're still getting, people are getting accustomed to what the legislative process actually looks and feels like, but we're continuing to progress. We want to move infrastructure in a bipartisan way, and we're going to continue to have conversation with a bipartisan group, Democrats and Republicans in the Senate. At the same time, the House this week is going to take up infrastructure legislation in committee. These processes are going to move forward. That's how this legislative process is intended to work.
Brian, let's pull back the camera. From the beginning, President Biden said that he would go big. Are you starting to think it's too big?
No, I think if anything, you look at the global situation and the competitive situation we find ourselves in, and these investments are even more vitally needed. So the American Jobs Plan, it's about 1% of GDP a year over an 8-year period is one way to think about it. Take a country like China. China is outpacing us in physical infrastructure. And just this year, they announced that they're going to invest 2% of GDP every year for the next 5 years, just in their digital infrastructure alone, just in building out 5G and high-speed internet. This is a global race to win the markets of the 21st century. And we have to acknowledge we're behind in that race. And now is the time for us to not only catch up, but lead. So I think that these investments are calibrated for the moment we find ourselves in to win that future, to win the clean energy markets of the future. And so I think that this is what we need to position our economy for success in the future. And both historically and in the context of what our counterparts and competitors around the world are doing, I think this is a very reasonable way to go.
Brian, you've talked about this as investment in R&D for the country in a way that we haven't seen since the 60s.
Well, if you look at something like our investment in R&D, what you saw in the 60s was that we invested, somewhere between 2.5% and 3% of GDP. And what we've seen in the intervening period is that's fallen to less than 1%. So what we're talking about is getting back to those levels when we saw big breakthroughs in our innovative capacity as a country. And one of the things that we know about investing in innovation and R&D is that it unlocks opportunity and it unlocks economic gains that you can't even imagine today, but that will be key to driving industries forward in the future. So part of this plan that the president is putting forward is to encourage America to imagine again. Imagine a world in which you could drive across the entire country without a tank of gas. Imagine a world in which we had a clean, pollution-free electricity grid. We had high-speed internet in every corner of this country. Those are not pie-in-the-sky ideas. Those are eminently achievable. We just have to invest in ourselves again.
And Brian, what's an example of a job of the future that could be created by the American Jobs Plan? Blow our mind, take us down the road.
Well, I won't even, I don't think we have to go to this sort of new age future. You can be very concrete and specific. Take a market like electric buses. Today, there's a nascent market to build electric buses in the US. We built about 1,000, manufactured about 1,000 of them last year. Last year, China manufactured 500,000 electric buses. These are the buses that our children ride to school, those yellow school buses that today, many of our children are breathing in particulate matter because those buses run on gasoline or diesel fuel. We could have American workers on assembly lines building clean electric buses for not only the domestic market, but for a growing global market as well, putting people to work all across the country on doing everything from assembling those to building the large battery packs that would power those for the future. You don't have to imagine an entirely new future. We just have to be willing to make the investments and make the policies to actually build that industry here in the United States.
Brian, we're about to get the hook here. So squeezing in two quick topics that are important to you. One, the president has been trying to fix parts of the nation's supply chain that were exposed and that were exacerbated, their deficiencies by COVID. This is a lot of what Washington does is hot air, but this is something that people see, feel in their communities.
Absolutely. And what I think a lot of people understood is, when COVID hit and we didn't have enough healthcare protective equipment, when COVID hit and all of a sudden grocery shelves were empty, and when we had a nationwide shortage of semiconductors, for example, these things affect people in their daily lives, but they expose vulnerability across and up and down our supply chains. President Biden has been on this from day one, issued an executive order requiring an all-of-government review. And in fact, just today, we announced the results of that 100-day review. and a number of concrete actions to build up stockpiles of protective equipment here in the United States, invest in the domestic production, working with our allies so that we have more reliable access to those goods when we're not going to produce those at home. This is going to take an all-of-government approach. It's not going to solve itself overnight, but we're committed to making sure that we never put ourselves or our economy at risk of being so vulnerable again in the future.
And Brian, real quick, what's an example of another supply chain that's been disrupted?
Well, I mean, I think most people saw healthcare, protective equipment, but also the APIs, the components that go into making pharmaceuticals. But I'll give you, another example is computer chips, where we're seeing shortages of everything that goes into your iPhone to the hundreds of computer chips that are in a vehicle. And in the short term, there's no quick fix for that. But in the long term, we have to step back and realize that the US used to produce 40% of the world's semiconductors. Now we produce about 10%. And the erosion of our domestic semiconductor base left us exposed in this circumstance where we see big fluctuations in supply and demand. So that's something that we're going to have to make a multi-year investment in trying to solve.
Brian, penultimate question. You retweeted a tweet this weekend from Steve Ratner about a decision by the finance ministers in London, including Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen, a tax deal. Steve Ratner said it's a BFD. Tell us why.
Because we never have had a global agreement to apply a minimum tax on global corporate earnings. And as a result, we've seen a race to the bottom to have companies move production and move profits to the lowest tax jurisdiction they can find. That hurts American workers. It hurts American innovation, and it's not good for our international counterparts as well. So we had a first step. The G7 agreed to putting in place a global minimum tax of at least 15%. That gives us momentum going into the G20 and ultimately the OECD to get a global agreement and then to enact domestic reform as well. So it is, to use Steve's term, it is a BFD, but it's also the beginning in a process that we're committed to deliver on. Will make our workforce more competitive and our companies more certainty globally as well.
And Brian, as we say goodbye, one fun thing, and I'm going to ask my Axios colleagues to put you up on the big screen because you drive an electric car.
I do. I've got a Chevy Bolt, drives great, and is incredibly quiet.
And I understand you have something nearby from one of your kids that you might show us.
Yes, hiding in the background here is Bob. This is a cicada. He's limited time only. My son made him and let me borrow him so that he's hanging in the White House for the duration of we all have cicadas with us. We will have Bob in the White House as well.
Well, thank you, Bob, for putting up with our conversation. Brian Deese, thank you for joining Axios.
Thanks, Mike.
And now we'll go to my colleague, Hans Nichols.
Thanks, Mike. I'm Hans Nichols, and I'm a political reporter at Axios. Our next guest is the chair of the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, Rep. Peter DeFazio, joining us from Washington, D.C., although I suspect he wishes he were back in Oregon. Congressman, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Hans. You got that right, but we got to get the job done here. We got to get this bill out today or tomorrow or the next day, so I'm here for that.
So I'm glad you sort of start off on the immediacy of this. You're a former county commissioner. You have a big district. You talk to a lot of folks. What are the county commissioners telling you is their need, and how does your old role help you understand and put that into legislation?
Well, the county I represented is the size of the state of Connecticut. We had a very extensive road network, and I learned very early on, the value and the needs of moving people and goods efficiently. I was recently on a call statewide with county commissioners, most of them Republican, actually, and they were talking about how they need they need partnership from the federal government. A lot of them have rural bridges that are failing, that are critical. They have issues particularly with water, wastewater, the other bill we're marking up, and they really need federal assistance. So this is critical.
If you have bipartisan support at the county level at home, why isn't there more of a movement to get bipartisan support at the federal level?
Well, I have certainly tried. The major stumbling block with my committee Republicans is climate change. They do not want my surface transportation bill to address climate change because they can't say or they don't believe in it. And for the wastewater bill, they say it's too big, even though it's only a fraction of the nation's needs. And it also has a climate title to capture methane from sewer plants and generate electricity. So they object to that. So that's a big stumbling block. I've reached out to them. We can work together on a lot of things, but they just will not address climate change.
Are you expecting any Republican support for your transportation bill, which I think is about $547 billion, or is this going to be a strictly partisan vote?
Probably coming out of committee, it will end up being partisan. Last year, when we had a bigger package on the floor with my transportation bill in it, we got 3 Republican votes. But we'll see. This is critical. The Senate moved out a bill out of, they have 3 committees that have share my jurisdiction. One of them has already moved a bill. They've already moved a bill out of the Senate on wastewater and drinking water, so we can begin to conference that. The numbers are quite a bit bigger than what my Republicans want and smaller than what I want or what the country needs and what the president wants. So we'll have a discussion with the Senate about that. And the service bill will involve 3 committees over there.
Now, you've been very clear that you don't want this to be Eisenhower 8.0. Explain what you mean by that. What's your goal with your big bill?
Look, Sid, if you look at the history of congestion in this country, we've been doing the same thing since the 80s. Roads get congested, you expand them, they get congested again, induced demand. We need to look at options where you can move people more efficiently by transit or commuter rail. And a lot of states just haven't been willing to do that. They just want to keep doing the same old thing, build the highway bigger. Virginia just walked away from expanding 95, and they're going to have a very ambitious rail project, including a new bridge over the Potomac, which will move people more efficiently and reduce congestion more. So I want states to look at those options, and the federal government will partner with them and help them fund them.
So you mentioned Virginia. What other states, what other cities are doing this well in terms of the mix between just building new roads and building mass transit?
Well, my home state, of course, Oregon. We have Portland, our largest city, has a tremendous amount of light rail and obviously a lot of bus service. But we need to do better, actually, even there. So, Los Angeles has done incredible stuff in the last few years with new subways and new transit options and commuter rail. And the MTA there is looking at high-speed rail that would go through the Tehachapi Mountains and connect with a high-speed rail from Las Vegas, which would be incredible. So these are the kind of things we have to look for, these partnerships, knitting things together and serving the country better and dealing with climate change at the same time.
Well, you mentioned sort of these high-speed rail and mass transit. What should be the right mix in a bill between sort of traditional infrastructure, traditional service transportation, and mass transit? Should it be 80-20? Should it be 90-10? What's the goal you're looking for?
Well, traditionally it's been 80-20, but we're having a much bigger pie this time because the surface transportation, the trust fund is exhausted. So I'm going to address transit needs with a 140% increase in transit, but there will also be a substantial increase in roads, bridges, and highways. We have 47,000 bridges in the National Highway System need to be repaired or replaced. 40% of the National Highway System deteriorated to the point we have to rebuild it, not just resurface it. And we have a $100 billion backlog to bring transit up to a state of good repair, let alone building out new options for people. So we need an ambitious bill that reflects what President Biden has proposed.
Well, when you look at the share that you're talking about, let's just put it at 500 billion, I think it's 547. That's roughly a fourth of what the president is proposing for infrastructure. How does your bill intersect with the Biden's American Jobs Plan and his broader infrastructure package?
Well, the American Jobs Plan is much bigger than my committee, much bigger than surface transportation, or even my wastewater bill. Drinking water will come out of energy and commerce, broadband, energy and commerce, sustainable power, grid reinforcement, ambitious EV charging, again, all partnering with the Energy and Commerce Committee. I have some EV charging in my bill, but they're going to do the bulk of it in their bill. The president's also proposing to deal with housing issues. That's a banking committee. To deal with education issues, school construction. That's ed and labor. And then he has the child care and the senior programs. These are all outside my committee. My bill is probably the single largest portion of the American Jobs Plan, but all these other parts are critical.
I think the word your bill is the largest vehicle, but I won't put words into your mouth. Congressman, you hinted at this earlier, and this is the idea that it's going to be a partisan bill, but you're probably also going to lose some votes because, as sort of progressive as you say your bill is, it's not doing enough for some members on your committee. Where do you expect to have some tough votes when progressives start offering amendments? And what's your argument to them that you're going far enough?
This is a totally transformative bill. It's the first 21st century infrastructure bill. All woven through it are provisions to deal with climate change. It's absolutely essential we get that policy. You can't make policy in the reconciliation process. You can't create all these new programs we need to create in the reconciliation process. My bill, it will be a core part of the American Jobs Plan, and it will be supplemented probably through reconciliation when they figure out where they're going to raise the monies for reconciliation. So this is a critical part of that package, but it is not the be all end all, and we have to get the policy done. It has to be done by October 1st, or we're stuck with the old policy.
Do you sense any movement from Republicans, either in the broader House or in the Senate, on climate change? Or are we basically locked in tribal positions?
I think there's a few Republicans who will admit to climate change on the House side. I don't know the Senate that well. I mean, they do have some climate provisions in the bill that came out of the committee in the Senate, Senator Carper's committee. They are way smaller than mine, but they're in there, and they are making a nod or some recognition toward climate change.
Okay, well, that seems like we've covered a lot of territory here, and it seems like you have some optimism that you could move Republicans along. I know you've got a lot of legislative heavy lifting to do. So, Congressman, we thank you for your time, and thanks for joining us at Axios.
Thanks, Hans. You'll see the results in a couple of days, probably. It'll take a while to get this done.
Okay, well, thanks again. And up next, we have the View from the Top segment with my colleague, co-founder and CEO at Axios, Jim Vandehei.
I'm Jim Vandehei, the CEO of Axios, and it's my pleasure to bring you a view from the top of United Airlines with United CEO Scott Kirby. Scott, how are you doing?
I'm well, Jim. Glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
Travel's back. People seem to be flying. How are you feeling about the state of United and how full are the planes? How should we think about travel in this moment?
Yeah. So we're really encouraged to see the rebound in travel and really the recognition of human desire to reconnect and to get back to experiencing the world. We're a long way from being all the way back, but leisure demand has recovered, I would say, over 100%. Business demand is still off by 75% or so, but we expect more and more people to be back in their office buildings post-Labor Day, and that'll probably lead to an inflection point in business demand. And then international borders are still closed around much of the world or require quarantines. And so long-haul international is still pretty severely depressed. But again, as borders open, we see huge waves of pent-up demand to go to those places when the borders are open.
For those who haven't hopped on a United flight in the last month or so, how is it different? Like, am I wearing a mask? Is there any additional screening? Like, how are you handling things?
Well, I encourage you all to get back out and flying. I've been flying a lot, and it's great to get back out on the road and seeing people and experiencing and meeting with friends and family you haven't seen in a while. What you'll find on United, I think, is the feel is very different. I mean, obviously, you're wearing masks. There's a huge emphasis on cleanliness and safety, things that are visible and noticeable. But also, I think what people experience more is just the way we make you feel at United. It feels a much more customer friendly, much more service oriented airline. The whole culture has really changed. Even the little things like getting on the airplane and having a flight attendant, hand you a little moist towel so that you can wipe down your seat if you want to. But that small human interaction, a lot of little things to improve the human interaction really has made a difference. We've had a 30-point improvement in our net promoter scores as we've gone through the pandemic, despite all the challenges. Really is reflective of what I hope will be the biggest permanent change at United Airlines as a result of this, which is a change in the customer service culture.
Before we plunge into infrastructure, you've been in the news of late purchasing supersonic jets, like 15 of them. What does that mean? Like, what's it going to be like if I'm on a supersonic jet? How fast? How cool?
Yeah, well, we were really excited last week to partner with Boom on an order for supersonic jets and really looking at the next generation. We're also excited about the fact that we have a commitment that these engines will run on 100% sustainable aviation fuel. But this will really it is the next generation, the next frontier of flight for our customers. They'll fly at Mach 1.7. So you can go, for example, between New York and London in 3.5 hours. Really the next frontier. And what we're excited about at United is this is just one more example of the leadership role that United is now playing really in global aviation. A series of firsts. And for employees that have been at United for 30 or more years, they remember a day when United was the leader and was notching up first one after the other. And we're really back to that, whether it's supersonic aircraft or only airline around the world that's invested in electric aircraft on the other end of the spectrum. Really excited to just be back into a leadership position and back to thinking about the future as we come out of this crisis.
You've been in and out of D.C. In the last several weeks. There's an infrastructure bill that is sort of the talk of the town, the big debate on Capitol Hill. Usually people think roads, bridges, rail, but it also affects airlines.
Yeah.
Like what should be in the infrastructure bill from the perspective of someone running an airline?
Well, we're very supportive of improving infrastructure here in the country. We hope that there can be a bipartisan deal on infrastructure because give us all a lot more confidence in the long term. There's a number of items in the bill related to FAA and getting to next generation aviation, which, by the way, is a way that we could literally cut carbon emissions by 10% in the industry, really think of it simply as using GPS to navigate instead of the kind of navigational tools that we've used for 100 years in aviation. So that's an important part of the aviation bill. And the other thing that I think is important is to really use the infrastructure bill as an opportunity to focus on clean energy, climate change. One of the initiatives that we hope will be in it for aviation is a sustainable aviation fuel credit. It's really how you give certainty to investors to invest in the sector, to do the same thing with sustainable fuels that we did with wind and solar, which with a little bit of credits from the government early on drove investment. We came down the cost curve, built up economies of scale, and it's now cheaper to produce a megawatt of electricity with wind or solar than it is for a coal power plant. And those kinds of initiatives for sustainable fuel and other green initiatives, we hope will be part of it in a bipartisan way because that can really seed the future for the country.
How much does the bill or should the bill deal with the airports themselves? Is it all typically done at the state and local level, or is there a role for the federal government?
There's not a huge portion of it for the federal government. The biggest issue we have at airports, by and large, is airspace and runways in some cases, but it's mostly airspace. And in the biggest and most crowded airports, there's really no room to build more runways, for example. So you take an airport, Newark. Newark is the most delayed airport in the country. Lots of demand. We'd like to fly more there. Other airlines would like to fly there more. but there's nowhere to build another runway. It's landlocked. And so I think the bigger initiatives are around really air traffic reform. That's how we can increase capacity in the system. That's how we can cut carbon emissions. That's how we can reduce time, is by making the available airspace and the available runway capacity more efficient.
Beyond infrastructure, like what else are you thinking about that Washington might act on that would specifically hit the airline industry?
Well, first, I'd say we appreciate at all of aviation the bipartisan response in the 3 CARES Act to keep the aviation infrastructure in place so that we are now here to support the recovery and be a part of the humanitarian response around the globe to COVID. But the biggest things that we're focused on in the near term is really in the infrastructure bill and what can be done around climate change initiatives. And in the shorter term, how do we get borders open? That's a really important point. How do we get borders open around the world? You look at kind of the data and the science on vaccination rates, case rates between the US and the UK, or the US and the EU, for example, and we're in a very similar place. And so the science would lead you to a conclusion of we can start to safely open those up, get those parts of the economy cranking up again, get people back to connecting. And that's not only important for the economy, that's an important part of how we, unite the globe. It's not the same doing these events on Zoom or Teams as being there in person and getting to know another culture. It really makes a difference in the world. And reopening borders is probably our top near-term initiative, actually.
Scott Kirby, we appreciate you for this conversation. Appreciate United making this broader conversation about infrastructure possible.
Thank you, Jim.
To all of you watching, please stick with us for our next segment.
Thanks, Jim. Our final guest is the ranking member of the House Subcommittee on Highway and Transit, Rep. Rodney Davis, joining us from Springfield, Illinois, which we all know from history. Congressman, thanks for being with us.
Hey, thanks for having me on, Hans.
So I want to start with sort of what you're hearing from local officials, what you're hearing from county commissioners, from people all across your district on what the need is, what needs to be done as sort of a first step on transportation, on infrastructure.
This is the reason why I had my Transportation Advisory Committee meet with me just last week. They talked about the need for a more certain regulatory environment. They're concerned that they can't get projects approved, especially as we're getting out of COVID, where we have DOTs and federal agencies not able to meet to actually get projects that are approved to the lettings to be able to build them.
So that almost sounds like you're speaking a different language than what we hear from some Democrats on the Hill, where the most of the focus is on how big the total package is going to be. There's also a debate on pay-fors. But what you're telling me is that there's a hidden cost, and that even though you have all these projects in the pipeline, they might not actually get built because of regulatory or environmental hurdles.
You're absolutely right, Hans. But we have to actually take first things first. As we're coming out of this pandemic, the workers that approve these projects, that do the environmental reviews, they've got to get back to work. They've got to be able to go meet with their counterparts at the state and local level, and they've got to be able to help our local officials be able to move these projects forward, because many very important projects in my district are at a standstill just because of a lack of communication. But you do mention the regulatory environment. This is why I've offered my amendment once again for the One Federal Decision Act that could lower the cost of projects, especially now as we're talking about working with Democrats who are going to ever increase the regulatory environment. And that's what we see in the Democrats' version that we're marking up tomorrow.
So your biggest problem then with what the Democrats are doing isn't the price tag, isn't the pay-fors, it's the lack of a streamlined process to actually get shovels into the ground and roads and bridges built.
That's a big, big problem. And it's something that I don't think my counterparts in the Democrat side want to address as much as we do. The bottom line is, everybody has proposed a much bigger highway reauthorization than has ever been proposed before in our lifetimes. The Republican version, Chairman DeBee, Ranking Member Graves, and I and the others who sponsored the Starter Act 2.0, we offer historic amounts of funding. The debate in Washington always seems to center around a number of how much is going to be spent. But there's not a lot of talk about how those dollars are going to actually go as far. Because if you increase the regulatory regime, as is planned in the Democrats' version, then it's going to raise the cost of every single project. And that increase in funding clearly will not go as far getting the work that we need to be done.
You know, Congressman, what I hear you saying, and I'm going to potentially mix a metaphor here, but we're talking about roads and bridges, is that there's more fuel efficiency with your approach. And that is you drive farther, you build more roads when you have less regulation. To what extent is this an argument about regulation, or to what extent is it an argument about just what the overall cost is going to be and how much Republicans are willing to spend?
Well, first off, I appreciate your fuel efficiency argument, Hans. And with your permission, I'm going to use that because I think it is a good metaphor for how we need to make improvements in the regulatory regime in Washington, D.C. And on the regulatory side, Hans, you've got to seriously take a look at what's happened in the past, where we seem to have environmental reviews on projects, not just road and bridge projects, but infrastructure projects across the board that go on in perpetuity. And that costs money. We've got to do what we can to introduce and pass my One Federal Decision Act, which I'm going to be offering as an amendment in the highway reauthorization markup, and it will reduce the regulatory environment to 2 years. I don't think that is something that can be overstated about how that will get us from ideas to the paperwork process and the engineering process and the review process to actual construction. And really, that's what my local officials talk to me about. They want that the most. And we've got to stop people that used to sit in concrete buildings in Washington, D.C., but don't as much anymore, from just bogging down the construction process because they won't allow the paperwork process to ever be completed or to actually move forward.
So 2 years seems like a significant period of time, but are there examples in your district or in your state where the review process has gone on longer than 2 years?
Well, I don't have to limit it to my state. Before we did something similar when Chairman Schuster was in charge of the Transportation Infrastructure Committee a few years ago. The Corps of Engineers on any project was taking an average of 15 years to complete all the reviews. That's enough. I mean, I'm all for making sure that we protect our environment. I'm all for making sure that we do the right reviews, but they can't go on for an average of 15 years. That's crazy. Let's come together and make sure that it can be done in 2. This is an issue I've talked to the president about, the vice president, and Secretary Buttigieg too.
Now, you've traveled a lot. You've been a member of Congress for some time now. When you see other countries, are other countries doing the review process smarter, faster, quicker than we are in the United States?
They certainly are. They're actually funding infrastructure in innovative ways that we are not here in the United States. And you see some of their infrastructure investments in large projects that we don't have, or that our projects take much longer and cost more to complete.
You know, you're in the middle of the state, in the middle of the country. You have a pretty good view, a pretty good vantage point, even though it's flat, on what the need is in terms of just traditional infrastructure and maybe more mass transit. 80-20 seems to be the sort of ratio that some people talk about. Where's that ratio for you on sort of just pure transportation as opposed to transit?
See, too many times in Washington, D.C., Hans, people get caught up in the overall funding levels or the ratios of what is going to be the federal and state match. The bottom line is, let's let the locals invest what they can and the federal government invest what they can to work in conjunction with our state and local officials to get projects fully funded. Let's not hinder their ability to pay more if necessary to get something done if we don't have enough at the federal level. That's why I'm really hesitant as we move forward to limit matching to certain percentages and certain ratios. Everybody, again, wants to talk about an overall number, but not as many people want to talk about those dollars being spent, like you said earlier, in a more fuel-efficient manner.
I'm going to jump from fuel efficiency and go to battery efficiency. Do you ever see yourself buying, and if you have one, let me know, buying an EV, an electric vehicle?
I do. As a matter of fact, a few years ago, when my good friend Janice Hahn was on the Transportation Infrastructure Committee with me, she would always tout the fact that she drove an electric car in Los Angeles. And I would talk to her as we left the T&I hearings, and I would say, Janice, you can't drive an electric car in my district and get home each night because we don't have enough charging stations. And we actually have too much distance because at the time, the battery in her Nissan Leaf would not last long enough for me to go out, drive it around my district, and go home. What we did is we traded for a day. She rented a Ford F-150 crew cab that I have, and I rented a Nissan Leaf. I got a chance to see the benefits of driving the Nissan Leaf in some of my smaller mini urban areas, and she got a chance to figure out they discriminate against parking big trucks in Los Angeles.
Well, I'll ask you maybe a harder question. It's a beautiful lawn behind you. Do you ever envision mowing that with an electric lawnmower with a lithium battery?
I do, but my zero-turn American-made Land Pride ZR52 is 19 years old and starts every time.
All right. Well, I'll let you have the last word on that. It looks like it needs to be. You're going to get some rain, and you may have to mow it here this weekend. Congressman, thanks so much for your time. We really appreciate it.
Thanks, Hans.
Well, thanks again, Congressman. And thanks to all of you for joining us for this virtual conversation. Hopefully it made you smarter, faster. Thanks to our sponsor, United Airlines, for making this entire event possible. We'd like you to sign up for our newsletters. My newsletter is Sneak Peek. We have other ones, www.axios.com. And in general, we look forward to seeing you there. Thanks for joining, and we'll see you at axios.com.